It would be a mistake, a gross oversimplification, really, to imagine the Ottoman Empire as some cultural fortress, cut off from Europe until the 18th century. In reality, contacts happen and ideas flow, but of course, it's more complicated than that. It's cautious, and it starts way earlier than many assume. Let's go back to Mehmed the Conqueror once more, the Sultan who takes Constantinople in 1453 and begins remaking the empire in both Eastern and Western terms. He's not just conquering, he's collecting stuff. He invites Venetian painter Gentile Bellini to Istanbul, commissioning portraits and bringing Western court art into the Ottoman orbit. Of course, these aren't to be mistaken for mass cultural exchanges, but the doors aren't locked either. So, fast forward to 1665, we find Evliya Çelebi, the legendary Ottoman traveler and chronicler, walking the streets of Vienna, enemy territory, the capital of the Habsburgs. He's curious, open eyed, and struck by what he sees. He marvels at the organ in St. Stephen's Cathedral, a musical machine unlike anything in the Ottoman world. He studies the architecture of the cathedral tower, admiring its vertical ambition. He even praises the skill of Viennese surgeons, a recognition not often expected from a Muslim traveler in the 17th century. But here's what's really fascinating. Evliya doesn't just observe, he's explaining stuff and he's trying to correct the stereotype that Christians worship images, a common belief in the Muslim world. Instead, he argues that icons are used as teaching tools, sorta, a kind of Biblia Pauperum, a Bible for the poor who can't read Latin. It's a remarkably empathetic interpretation. So, who's telling him this? We don't really know. Maybe a priest, maybe a translator. It might be a scholar. Evliya strikes up a conversation within some crowded Viennese square. You can only speculate, but the fact that such a dialogue could happen, that's the point. Still, it's the 18th century when everything accelerates. Under Sultan Ahmed III, the Sultan of the so called Tulip era, the court takes a bold step. It sends an official ambassador to France. His name is 28 Mehmet Çelebi, and his mission isn't military, it's cultural. He's told to observe, to report on life at the court of Louis XV, and to catalog the curiosities of Paris. And what comes back is gold. 28 Mehmet's report is full of sharp, careful observations. He's no stiff diplomat. He's chosen for his social intelligence, for his ability to mingle, to listen, to see what isn't in the guidebooks. His report describes fountains, gardens, technology, urban planning, and even social customs. This is not just a document, this is really a mirror held up to the Ottoman court, if you think about it. And what the empire sees reflected back, it really fascinates them. And now, in the early 18th century, something stirs up the world of Ottoman court art. The old traditions still hold, there's still miniatures, floral motifs, abstract ornamentation, all carefully respecting the Islamic limits, of course, on depicting living beings. But now there's a restlessness of some sort, a curiosity, an urge to try something different, to bring the outside world into the palace's visual language. And right in the middle of this quiet upheaval is Abdülcelil Levni. Levni isn't just another court painter. He's a visionary, a stylistic bridge builder, if you want. And his work is grounded in the classic arts of book illumination. But his influences are sprawling. He studies not only the great Persian masters, the backbone of Islamic visual culture, but also looks to European forms. He's borrowing techniques, playing with depth, texture, and movement. So in 1720, under the rule of Ahmed III, Levny gets the commission of a lifetime to depict the circumcision celebrations for the Sultan's sons, an enormous imperial spectacle. And Levny delivers. He creates an entire visual chronicle of the event, crowded scenes, pageantry, processions, fireworks, festivities. It's really life in motion here. His compositions carry a rhythm. They are theatrical and unprecedented in Ottoman art. And Levny doesn't just stop there. He begins experimenting with individual portraits. So we see a lot of youths in elaborate costumes, captured in poised, elegant stillness. We see traditional Ottoman dress, but also European clothing, woven seamlessly into the same frame. So these images really speak to a world where East and West are no longer opposites. They're in dialogue with each other. And that visual curiosity spreads. So among the Ottoman elite, a new taste emerges. They're no longer just interested in people and court scenes, but now they are beginning to be interested in landscapes. The traditional floral patterns, all the tulips and carnations, stylized vines, etc., they begin to share wall space with city views, river scenes, islands, harbors, mosques, and even boats drifting across the Bosporus. So we see a lot of panoramic views, often inspired by European engravings and prints, but reshaped through Ottoman sensibilities. Light and shadow sneak in, artists toy with depth, hinting at three dimensionality, a move away from the flattened elegance of the old miniature style. And while we don't know their names, these artists leave no signatures, no manifestos. Their experiments survive, and they speak of a court that's watching the world and then turning that gaze back inward, trying to paint itself anew. Of course, we need to be careful and not overanalyze this into some sort of rebellion or even westernization. No, that's not the point here. They're just being curious with their brush. And that's just how change begins often, isn't it? The Ottoman search for artistic renewal in the 18th century is not a one way street to Versailles. Yes, the court in Istanbul is sending ambassadors to France, admiring fountains, absorbing Rococo elegance, but across the empire, others are digging into different routes, reaching backward instead of outward, looking for meaning in older Islamic traditions, even in forgotten dynasties. Take Egypt, for example. There, the blueprint for inspiration isn't Louis XV, it's the Mamluks. The Mamluks, again, these are warrior slaves turned kings, rulers of Cairo before the Ottomans arrived in 1517. And their style is bold, monumental. It's covered in calligraphy and muscle bound architecture. By the 18th century, Ottoman governors in Egypt, especially power figures like Abdulrahman Katkoda, begin to revive that, not as nostalgia, but as a statement. Katkoda isn't just copying Mamluk forms, he's rather channeling their authority, their prestige, their local legacy. And in doing so, he sort of shapes an Egyptian Ottoman hybrid style, one that says, we are part of the empire, but we remember our own past. And then there's the family of Ishak Pasha, way out in Doğu Beyazıt, perched on the rugged frontier between the Ottoman and Iranian worlds in this windswept outpost, if you want, where the mountains rise like fortresses, and the architecture follows suit. When the Ishak Pasha family commissions their palace in the second half of the 18th century, they don't turn to Mamluk geometry or European flourishes. They dig even deeper, 5 centuries deep, into the legacy of the Seljuks. Yes, the Seljuks, Turkic rulers who once dominated Persia and Anatolia in the medieval age, long before the Ottomans were even a whisper on the world stage, right? And the palace reflects that choice. We see arched portals, carved stone reliefs, massive symmetrical courtyards, decorative brickwork. These are all hallmarks of Seljuk design, resurrected in a time when most of the empire has already moved on. When we think about it, art here is really about identity, about claiming lineage, not just to the House of Osman, but to the older warrior legitimate traditions of rule. So the Seljuk revival in Doğu Beyazıt is really politics in stone. It's a way of saying we belong to something deeper, something ancient. So while Istanbul toys with perspective and Parisian gardens and Cairo revives the warrior glory of the Mamluks, Eastern Anatolia whispers in the language of empire past. Let's now look at the influence of scholars, travelers, and political writers. In the 17th century, while the Ottoman Empire is already cracking under the weight of all the wars, rebellions, and all the economic stress, we see that Istanbul is still thinking a lot. The capital is just filled with scholars, translators, bureaucrats, and rogue thinkers. They're pulling ideas from Persian, Arabic, Latin, and increasingly from Europe. We see one man rising above the rest, with his pen, not with his sword. Katip Çelebi. Katip Çelebi, they call him Mr. Scribe, a humble title that really hides his great intellect. He's born Mustafa Abdullah and known in the West as Haj Khalfa. This man is a walking archive, a mind that refuses to stay within the borders of his tradition. He writes everything: histories, bibliographies, political commentaries, and even state reform treatises. The guy is reading obsessively and he's compiling, cross referencing, summarizing whole civilizations of thought into works that scholars still crack open today. But his masterwork, the one that cements his legacy, is a book called The Cihan-Numa, The View of the World. Now, this isn't just like a list of provinces or a traveler's log. Katip Çelebi is trying to do something much bigger than that. He wants to map out all known geography, Ottoman, Islamic, and European, in a single, unified framework. This guy is not just looking into Arabic cosmographies or Persian geographies. He's reading Dutch atlases, especially the Atlas Minor, and he's translating the categories and styles of European mapmaking into the Ottoman scholarly tradition. And he's not just imitating, by the way, he's trying to really bring his world up to date without abandoning his own roots. He rewrites the Cihan-Numa multiple times as new sources pour in. New maps, new measurements, new worldviews. He never finishes it. The scope is just too big. When he dies in 1657, it remains a living manuscript, half born but still powerful. His friends pick up where he leaves off, and then in 1732, something revolutionary happens. The Cihan goes to print. It becomes one of the first Ottoman works ever printed using movable type. A moment that's less Gutenberg and more quiet revolution. Where print meets empire in a city that's been suspicious of presses for generations. The book is part map, part manifesto. It says to its readers, look outward. The world is bigger than we thought, and it's changing. And in a time of military stagnation and political paralysis, that message is both dangerous and also desperately needed when you think about it. Somewhere around 1610, a boy is born in Poland, baptized as Albertus Bobovius. He's raised in the Latin Christian world and trained in its music, its languages, its worldview, but history has other plans for him. He is captured, possibly during one of the endless Ottoman-Polish skirmishes, and he's taken to Istanbul. And instead of vanishing into slavery or anonymity, he reinvents himself. He becomes Ali Ufki. Now, don't mistake Ali Ufki for just another Muslim convert or just another court servant. This guy rises to hold one of the most sensitive cultural posts in the entire Ottoman Empire. He becomes the music director of the Enderun. The Enderun is the elite page choir at the Topkapı Palace. In the Ottoman court, music is more than entertainment. It's a power vehicle, it's ceremony, it's mysticism and science at the same time. To direct music here is to help shape the rhythm of the empire, and Ali Ufki does it with both Ottoman sensibility and European technique. He brings with him the notation systems of the West. He starts writing down pieces that, until then, existed only in oral tradition. His transcriptions are unprecedented, sheets of Ottoman court music preserved in a hybrid style, European notation capturing Islamic melody. And many of those musical manuscripts survive. They sit today not in Istanbul, but in European libraries. They are testimonies to a man whose body lived in one world and whose mind walked between two. Apart from writing music, Ali Ufki reads, he learns Arabic, Persian, Ottoman, Turkish. He writes dictionaries, religious translations, even a Turkish language Bible in Ottoman script, probably aimed at other converts or diplomats navigating this cultural frontier. And he makes friends in both worlds. One of his closest is Antoine Galland, the French Orientalist and eventual translator of The 1001 Nights, a man who sits at the dawn of Europe's romantic obsession with the East. Galland and Ali Ufki exchange ideas, books, experiences. Istanbul is their meeting point, a cosmopolitan melting pot where faith, language, and culture intermingle. Ali Ufki never returns to Poland. He dies in Istanbul around 1675. A man with no simple label. Not a renegade, not a missionary. He's something else, something more rare. He really is a cultural chameleon, a hybrid intellectual, and in many ways, a prototype of the modern global citizen, centuries before such a thing is supposed to exist. in the late 1600s as the Ottoman Empire grapples with crisis after crisis, military setbacks, internal revolts, a shifting geopolitical chessboard. Another kind of Ottoman voice rises: the chronicler, the analyst, the historian philosopher. That is Mustafa Naima. Born in 1655 in Aleppo, a city pulsing with trade, languages, and scholarship, Naima grows up speaking both Arabic and Ottoman Turkish. This guy is growing up between two worlds, and when he begins to write, he doesn't just compile names and dates, he goes ahead and tries to explain why empires rise and fall. In order to do that, he looks backwards, like way backwards. His model is the legendary Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century North African thinker, who practically invents the idea of social science centuries before anyone gives it a name. Ibn Khaldun's theory is elegant, brutal, and hauntingly cyclical. Strong desert tribes bound together by what he calls asabiya, a kind of intense group solidarity. They sweep in, conquer settled societies, and found new dynasties. But once they settle down, they start wearing silk and drinking sherbet and building palaces. The fire dies, the solidarity erodes, and the dynasty begins to rot from within. So Naima picks up this idea and he drives it straight into the Ottoman narrative. He writes a massive chronicle covering the years 1591 to 1660, a time he did not personally witness, but one he understands through sources, stories, and most importantly, theory. Now, unlike his contemporaries, Naima doesn't view the empire as something divinely preordained. He views it as a living creature, something that is born, something that grows, matures, and perhaps decays eventually. And that is dangerous because to suggest that the Ottoman Empire is part of a natural life cycle is to suggest that its decline is inevitable. That no matter how many viziers are executed or reforms are proposed, the imperial body is aging. That the asabiya, the raw social cohesion that once bound the warriors of the steppe and the pious founders of the dynasty, is slipping away. Naima doesn't shout this from the rooftops, of course, but he weaves it into his chronicle. His readers know the message is there. Empires, like people, die. His style is sharp, his resources are serious, but it's that framework, that Khaldunian idea of historical cycles, that sets him apart. He dies in 1716, but his chronicle lives on. It becomes the first Ottoman history to be officially sponsored by the state, a kind of authorized soul searching, if you want. It's in moments of doubt when empires look to their historians, and Naima gives them not comfort, but context. Around the year of 1769, the Ottoman Empire is at war again. It's marching into a war it shouldn't win, against an enemy it doesn't understand, in a moment it hasn't prepared for. The war party howls for glory against the rising force of Russia, but not everyone is cheering. One man, Ahmed Resmi, stands in the shadows and says, "This is madness." Ahmed Resmi is not your average armchair scholar. Born around 1700, he spent a lot of time in diplomatic missions, court politics, and negotiations in Europe, especially in Vienna and Berlin. and what he sees there shocks him. In Berlin, he's greeted with curiosity, almost like a zoo exhibit, because many of the Prussians have never seen a real Ottoman before. The way he describes it is tinged with amused distance, like a man watching a civilization trying to figure out what it's looking at. The real impact, of course, doesn't come from how they see him, it comes from how he sees them. He watches how Frederick the Great rules, efficient, rational, calculating, not some messianic warlord or philosopher king, but a man who knows the weight of a coin and the price of a soldier. Resmi starts to absorb something Ottoman statesmen rarely say aloud, that European states operate under rules that apply to everyone, Muslim and non Muslim alike. That lesson hits home brutally during the Russo Ottoman War of 1768. Resmi tries to stop it. He wants the port. The empire is overextended, the army is unready, the treasury is brittle, and Catherine the Great's Russia is hungry and modernizing fast. Of course, no one listens. The war unfolds into disaster. The Ottoman navy is annihilated at Cheshme. The Russians sponsor revolts. The empire bleeds silver and soldiers. As the smoke clears, Resmi, now part of the negotiating team, is forced to help pick up the pieces. He draws a conclusion that still rings. Muslim and non Muslim states are not exceptions to each other, they are participants in the same brutal logic. It doesn't matter if you pray in a mosque or a cathedral. If you overreach, if your resources don't match your ambitions, you collapse. He writes it plainly. A ruler who misjudges his empire's natural possibilities, as he puts it, ends up taxing his people into ruin. It's a shot across the bow of Ottoman exceptionalism. It's the voice of rationalism in an age still hooked on divine destiny. Ahmed Resmi doesn't become a revolutionary, he doesn't lead a coup, but he lays down the ideological foundations for realism, for an Ottoman state that might survive not by invoking the past, but by understanding the present. Ahmed Resmi dies in 1783, just as the empire begins its long tortured dance with reform. But his message stays the same, and it's whispered in the ears of later bureaucrats and diplomats. It says, "You're not special. You are only as strong as your strategy and as weak as your illusions." Okay, now we've been talking about scholars and art and travelers. Let's look at how life was in the countryside, shall we? So, around the early 1600s is when Sultan Murad IV, who's flush with military victories and convinced that he's tamed the empire's disorder, decides that it's time to put things back the way they were. The peasant refugees, those who've scattered into forests, cities, swamps, and borderlands during the collapse of the countryside, he wants them back. So he orders a return to normalcy. People are to go home. Villages are to be rebuilt. Fields are to be worked again. The reality of things looks a lot different than what was ordered. Many of the peasants sold everything before they fled. Others lost their land to opportunists, state officials, local strongmen, men with the right friends in Istanbul. Property lines are redrawn with bribes and blades. Try to return now, and you find your old house is someone else's estate. And even if you do go back, there's another problem: security. Or rather, the lack of it. Out in the forests, in the steppes, bandits still roam. Deserted regions haven't magically become safe just because the Sultan says they should. The rule of law isn't restored with a proclamation. It requires presence, force, and trust, none of which exist in large enough quantities. We get a chilling account from Grigor, an Armenian priest from the eastern town of Kema. Murat orders Grigor and a caravan of Muslims and Christians to return to their shattered homeland. What follows is less a homecoming and more a brutal epic. It's a true odyssey through ruined villages, haunted roads, and lawless zones. Grigor's story shows us what Murat's orders can't, that the social fabric of Anatolia has been shredded. And stitching it back together isn't just hard, it might actually be impossible. So the long term effects here are stark. The central Anatolian steppe, once a spine of Ottoman rural life, is increasingly emptied out. Villages vanish, fields lie fallow. It's not warlords or rebels here, it's abandonment that kills the land. But some regions buck the trend. The hills, rugged, defensible, tucked away, they still hold life. More islands, river bends, forest fringes. Anywhere hard to reach, really, becomes a survival zone. And the coastal regions, especially around Izmir, begin to boom. The city becomes a magnet, flourishing in trade, attracting people fleeing the fragile interior of the empire. So now the Ottoman landscape is tilting, population shifting toward commerce, coast, and protection, while the interior empties like a drained reservoir. Murat IV tries to command the peasants back, but what he finds is what any ruler finds in this era is that once people break faith with the state, once they run, it's nearly impossible to call them home. Of course, by the 16th century, many of the nomadic tribes of western and central Anatolia, the Turkmen, the Yuruks, and others, they have more or less settled down. They've built homes, claimed grazing rights. Some have even grown accustomed to taxation and regulation. But with the emptying out of Anatolia and the abandoning of villages, new nomadic groups actually start flowing in, coming from the east, drawn like iron to the gaps left in the imperial landscape. And here we get one of those moments when seemingly minor demographic shift starts to carry a serious geopolitical weight. One such group can be tracked step by step. They move west of Konya, then drift even farther, all the way to the island of Rhodes. I mean, Rhodes, think about that for a second. A group that begins on the Anatolian plateau ends up on a fortress island in the Aegean. In the meantime, the villagers panic. These nomads, they show up with horses, weapons, and they have no hesitation whatsoever. They're not asking permission. They're driving cattle straight into the unharvested fields, trampling grain that took months to grow. Even worse, they storm into gardens which are much smaller, of course, more fragile, and often the last line of food security for peasant households. And remember, this is a time when the Ottoman state is already wobbling. It's already struggling to collect taxes, fighting off rebels and foreign enemies. And here's the twist: the state actually listens. Reports of nomadic harassment, they are taken seriously. The Ottoman center may be struggling, but it knows full well if rural producers stop farming, the entire fiscal system will collapse eventually. Now, it's not all hostility. There are still places where villagers and nomads cooperate, trade, even intermarry. Peaceful coexistence is very real still, but that doesn't stop the central government from seeing the new arrivals as a potential threat, especially when start acting like they own the land, right? Rather than just passing through it. So what we are seeing here isn't just demographic shift, it's really a test of sovereignty. Can the state manage these mobile populations? Can it regulate grazing, enforce boundaries, and keep both sides from exploding into open conflict? Because if it can't, then the heartland of the empire turns into a patchwork of competing authorities, where the rule of law is only as strong as the next armed horseman. So, this is when, by the late 1600s, the Ottoman leadership is thinking long term. The nomads, those mobile herders with their flocks and weapons and ever shifting loyalties, are seen as a problem that needs fixing. After all, farmers can be taxed, right? Farmers stay put, farmers fill registers, nomads they don't. So the plan is hatched: settle them. But not just anywhere. The Ottomans choose a region that makes strategic sense. The borderlands between Syria and Anatolia. It's a harsh zone, but that's the point. It's on the fringe of the desert, a buffer area long raided by Bedouin tribes. If these newly settled nomads can hold their ground, maybe they'll act as a kind of human shield, if you want. Still warlike enough to defend themselves, but now under imperial watch. There's just one problem with this whole idea. The land is garbage. The terrain is dry, it's often unsuitable for cultivation, and while the administration says it's sending engineers and surveyors ahead to locate water sources, springs, buried wells, it's unclear if those findings are followed. Bureaucratic optimism collides with on the ground negligence. And when the families actually arrive, thousands of them, they don't get tools, they don't get seed, and they definitely don't get flood aid. They do get orders, however, and dirt. So what happens next is exactly what you expect. No water, no harvest, no backup. The flocks, the nomads' lifeblood, begin to die. Grazing land is scarce, and little there is can't support herds at scale. Within a few seasons, many of these tribes are in free fall. Some try to hold on, others abandon the settlements. And once you've lost your herds, your food source, your economic base, really, what do you turn to? You begin raiding, right? So, just like that, the would be frontier farmers become desperate bandits instead, haunting the same roads they were supposed to protect. The state, instead of solving the nomad problem, has now created a new breed of predator. And they are hungry, they are displaced, and very furious. This whole thing, the whole story, is as old as the empire itself, right? You're trying to force a culture shift here without infrastructure, without support, without respect for how people actually live. And you can't act shocked when it backfires. In the background of war and rebellion, Ottoman agriculture keeps chugging along. Not just the kind that feeds the village or stocks the granary, but cash crops, farming meant for profit, trade, and export. And few things embody this better than olives. Olives grow wherever the climate permits, in the hills of northern Syria, around Jerusalem, across northwestern Anatolia near Edremit, and in the rich soil of Tunisia. But above all, one place comes to dominate Ottoman olive production by the mid 17th century: the island of Crete. It's a long, brutal war from 1645 to 1669. That's 24 years, right? Before the Ottomans finally wrest Crete from Venetian hands. But when they do, they inherit more than a strategic island. They inherit an olive empire. This oil isn't just for salad dressing. In the early modern world, olive oil is lighting, soap, medicine. It's ritual. It's burned in mosque lamps as far as Mecca and Medina, packed into crates for soap factories in Jerusalem, northern Syria, and, of course, Crete itself. And here's where it gets really interesting. A big chunk of that oil leaves the empire entirely. Marseille, the rising French port on the Mediterranean, becomes a magnet for Ottoman oil. They are making soap there too, and they want the good stuff, right? By the 18th century, oil is flowing out of Tunisia, the Peloponnese, and Crete to meet the demand in southern France. But this whole, let's call it economic entanglement, in places like coastal Tunisia, this whole olive trade thing doesn't just bring in money, it also brings dependence with it. So that's why the region becomes tied to French consumption and it's pulled into Western capitalism, really. The whole incorporation process happens through not through decree or treaty, it happens through barrels of oil, soap contracts, and just the steady tug of market gravity, really. It's a subtle form of imperialism, if you want. And it's already happening before Napoleon ever sets foot in Egypt. We've talked about olives. Let's talk about cotton, which, of course, has been around for centuries in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially in the coastal plains where the sun is harsh and the soil is just right. And in earlier times, the Ottoman state treats cotton as if it was some strategic material. Why? Because cotton isn't just used for clothing. Cotton is essential for sailcloth if you think about it, and that means navies. It powers fleets, both Ottoman and foreign. So, therefore, in the 16th century, the government bans its export. The fiber stays in the empire. But around 1600 something changes. The ban is lifted, and Ottoman cotton starts moving again across markets and borders. And by the 18th century, cotton has become one of the hottest commodities on sea lanes. French merchants from Marseille flooded into Izmir and Saida, modern day Sidon, in Lebanon. They are drawn by bales of raw, spun, or dyed cotton. It really becomes a cornerstone of East Mediterranean trade. And here's what makes this whole thing different from the later cotton empires of the Atlantic world. There's no giant plantations, no massive estates. Instead, we see this Ottoman cotton economy is powered by small farmers, really, local villages growing for market, not just for themselves. Those peasants are commercially minded producers and they are very tuned into price trends. They know about harvest cycles and shipping schedules, and floating above them taking a cut of everything are the local tax collectors. These men, often appointed by the state, sometimes effectively freelancing, they become key middlemen. They collect the dues, but also organize the export process, strike deals, and sometimes bankroll the harvests. Some of them get rich, like really rich, so rich, in fact, that they transform into local magnates. In Ottoman records, they are called ayan, men who wield economic, social, and even military power in their provinces. It's all built on cotton money. And once again, as with the olive trade, we see a regional incorporation, sort of a slow pull toward the French economy, even while the political borders stay Ottoman. It's Marseille, not Istanbul, that sets the tone. And it is ships, not armies, that carry Ottoman cotton outward and foreign influence inward. So we talked about life in the countryside for now. And around 1720 is when something unexpected is happening in the Ottoman Empire. Not in the capital, not in the courts, but in the provinces themselves. It's in places like the Balkans, where men who were once simple muleteers, moving goods from village to village, they're climbing the economic ladder all of a sudden. And these guys, they start small. In the winter, when work slows down, their families are weaving coarse woolen cloth, tough and functional, in places like the Plovdiv region of southern Bulgaria. But around spring, the muleteers, they load up their animals and head out to market. But not just the next town over. They go hundreds of miles, sometimes across borders. And that's where it all starts to snowball. Instead of just selling cloth, these traders start learning markets. They start figuring out demand, tracking price fluctuations. By the time they're doing this for a few seasons, many have shifted from carriers to dealers, then to long distance merchants. Some even making it as far as the Leipzig trade fair in the Holy Roman Empire. Let that sink in for a second. An Ottoman merchant from a Bulgarian hill town is doing business in Saxony. And it's not luck, it's all hustle. These guys are using what we today call aggressive marketing, undercutting rivals, building long term contacts, offering favorable credit terms. They are flexible, mobile, and ruthlessly pragmatic. You start to see small, tightly connected merchant networks forming, linking Ottoman provincial towns to Western European trade hubs. And this is decades before the railroads, before steamships. It's all happening by muscle, hoof, and grit. This isn't the Ottoman world as a static, declining state. We see a dynamic, entrepreneurial, and globally connected empire. They might be losing ground on the battlefield, but in the marketplace, they are very much alive. And it's not just with the goods that are moving, they also have lots of ideas, information, currencies, language skills, and, cross cultural know how flowing around. This is why, in the early 18th century and across the Ottoman Empire, in the ports, European merchants who, used to be dominant and unchallenged, really, they start feeling the pressure, not from imperial tariffs or naval blockades, but from Christian locals, Greeks, Armenians, Levantines, who've sharpened their business acumen and are now competing head on with the big European firms. And they're not limiting themselves to trade. They're producing stuff. In Tokat, deep in the heart of Anatolia, you hear the clang of copper and the rhythm of looms. They are producing printed cotton, vibrant, tough, and desirable. Meanwhile, Bursa is humming again, famous for its silks, both cotton blended and lightweight varieties designed for the eastern Mediterranean heat. Off the Anatolian coast, on Chios, silk manufacturing thrives, delicate, high quality, well connected to the Mediterranean markets. And in the textile hubs of southern Anatolia and northern Syria, a fascinating trend emerges. Local printers begin to mimic Indian fabrics. You know, those Indian fabrics, those bright, intricate chintzes and calicos that had dominated fashion in Europe since the 17th century. Sometimes those Ottoman knockoffs get exported right back to France. Yeah, copies of Indian cloth made in Syria and Anatolia are now good enough to be re exported to the very markets that used to import from India directly. It's really an economic echo. India via Aleppo. Of course, all of this isn't an accident. It's the fruit of a relatively peaceful window, starting with the Treaty of Passarovcha in 1718. After decades of bruising war with Austria and Russia, the Ottomans finally catch a breather, especially on their western and northern fronts, and they use it. The empire begins to restore security along the long distance trade routes that had been ravaged by the chaos of the late 17th century, especially the War of 1683 to 1699, when the empire threw everything it had at Vienna and let bandits swarm over Anatolia and Syria like locusts. Now, the Ottomans built khans, inns, and trading posts that often become the seeds of new towns. It's a kind of reinvestment in infrastructure, the lifeblood of any trading economy. But like many golden ages, this one is fragile. Sometime between 1760 and 1770, the momentum faltered. And the reasons, well, they're hard to say. The records are sparse. It could be a combination of renewed war, global economic shifts, internal mismanagement, or just the unpredictable tides of capitalism. But one thing's very clear here: this wasn't decline. This was an Ottoman economic moment, a chapter when artisans and traders, muleteers and merchants, Christian and Muslim alike, pushed their way into global circuits. And for a time, they were actually able to hold their own. Now imagine you are standing in 18th century France. What you would see is the economy picking up steam, trade is booming, and markets are expanding. And it's at almost the exact same moment when, across the sea in the Ottoman world, economic life is flourishing too. And that's not just a coincidence. The Ottoman Empire has become a part of global economy and it's fully integrated. It's maybe even, a little ahead of schedule. When you become integrated into the world economy, that usually means you become a supply of raw materials, a dumping ground for manufactured goods from the core, meaning Europe. Think cotton from Egypt, sugar from the Caribbean, tea from Bengal. The stuff that fuels European industry, but often hollows out the economies that produce it. But that's not what we see in this Ottoman case. If Tokat is making copper and printed cloth, if Bursa's silk and Chios weaves are competing in export markets, and if these products are moving not just abroad but also throughout the Ottoman domestic network, then the empire isn't being reduced to a raw material zone. It's producing, it's competing, innovating on its own terms. So this feels more like a regional boom than an imperial dependency, more internal dynamism than external domination. For that reason, some of the skeptics say that we shouldn't be talking about global integration into the world economy. We should talk about Ottoman expansion with its own commercial sphere. And that raises a rather thorny point. If this economic upswing is not driven by European penetration, then maybe what crashes later by the 19th century isn't actually a result of finally joining the modern world, but of being dragged into someone else's game. So by the 18th century, when we have a look at the Aegean coastline, we see that it's booming and its trade routes are full of ships loading and unloading night and day. Those little port towns that used to be provincial backwaters, they suddenly look like they're on a main stage of global commerce. Take Ambalikia and Thessaly, for example. It's such a small place. When you try to find it on a map, you will struggle, but yet its spinners crank out cotton yarn so fine that first English, then Austrian textile mills, they fight to lock down every bale they can get. There is, however, a price to being integrated into the world's economy like that, because while demand from Manchester or Vienna can shoot local fortunes through the roof, in the same way a single downturn can knock the whole thing over, right? The growers, the spinners, the middlemen, they're now lashed to economic tides they can't predict and definitely cannot control. And that brings us to the puzzle of the late 1700s war economy. Conventional wisdom says that war equals boom, right? Factories roar, granaries empty into army wagons, everybody gets paid. But not this time. Instead, the Ottoman war machine sputters. Muskets, powder, grain, even horse fodder. Producers can't keep up. And why is that? Look at how the army bankrolls itself. The high command pays suppliers below cost, or worse, demands goods for free, a classic short term fix that bleeds the very industries it depends on. Capital dries up, workshops close, farmers hold back grain because selling means losing money. Suddenly, the front lines are starving, the arsenals half empty. The empire has been using these forced purchases since Suleiman's day. So, why does the system collapse now? There's two reasons that jump out. First, warfare gets brutally more expensive in the 18th century. Bigger armies, more artillery, longer campaigns. And then, second, the Ottoman economy never really scales up to match that cost curve. Capital formation, saving big, reinvesting bigger, that has always been the underlying strategy here. But by 1750, that weakness becomes fatal. So, what we see is the empire marching into modern war with a medieval wallet, really. And the bill comes due on the battlefield and in every market stall from Izmir to Aleppo. Aside from the economic boom, around 1600 we also see a boom in women finally being mentioned in local court records in an abundant and detailed manner. These records, they start telling stories that official chronicles never bothered to mention. We're talking not about queens or concubines. We're talking about city women, regular people, whose names show up again and again in disputes over land, debt, and inheritance. And they show up because under Islamic religious law, they've got something a lot of early modern women elsewhere don't. They have property rights. Sure, a woman only inherits half of what a man gets in the same family tier, but she does inherit. And more importantly, she keeps it. When she marries, her property doesn't vanish into her husband's ledger. She doesn't lose her legal identity. She can sue her husband, show up in court alone, and defend her rights like any male plaintiff. And she does. You open a Kadir court register from Aleppo, Bursa, or Sarajevo, and you find women taking their brothers to court over disputed inheritances, suing cousins who've tried to edge them out of the family house. Some are pushing back on unpaid dowries or claiming their share in joint properties. These aren't isolated cases. These are patterns, and it doesn't stop there. You also see women acting as creditors. They're lending small sums of money, often to neighbors or acquaintances. They show up in debt records, negotiating repayments, earning modest income through finance. In some cities, that's their side hustle, microcredit. They own houses, they inherit gardens, they lease rooms, collect rent, manage orchards. They have become economic agents. And while we don't want to over romanticize this, it's still a patriarchal society after all. The legal framework recognizes their capacity, and the surviving documentation proves they used it. And this, right here, changes the game because it means that even far from the top tiers of imperial power, Ottoman women had leverage. Not always much, but not always enough, but more than their European counterparts in many places at the time. And the evidence is not buried in palace scrolls. It's right there in the everyday paperwork of Ottoman urban life. This is why by 1600, in a place like Ankara, the records start telling us about women at the very edges of the social fabric. Not the wealthy litigants we've seen suing for land or collecting debts. These women are too poor to even register in most sources. But we do find them occasionally, like when a family desperate for income rents out a young daughter as a maid, a besleme. It's not some formal contract, it's survival. She's probably working in someone else's kitchen, maybe helping raise their kids, maybe getting paid in food and fabric more than actual coin. Or when a freed slave girl gets a dowry, a rare but powerful sign that even in a rigid system, mobility is possible. Not common, not easy, but possible. She's no longer property, she owns some. A trousseau, maybe even a small home. And suddenly she's got choices. But then we follow the thread, literally, into the textile cities. In places like Bursa or Ankara, the economy weaves women into its fabric more literally than most. These towns are humming with looms, spindles, dye pots, and here, home based piecework becomes a lifeline for women who can't or won't enter the male dominated market. Women spin, they embroider, they finish textiles meant for export or local sale. It's really not glamorous, but it's work, it pays, it gives them a stake, however small, in the economy. And sometimes, just sometimes, it gives them recognition. Take Despineta, an Orthodox Christian embroiderer in Beşiktaş, right outside Istanbul around 1700. She's not just working In the shadows, she signs her work. She embroiders for local churches. Her name survives, not because she was wealthy, but because she was good. This is what makes these stories matter. Because behind every sultan and vizier and janissary is a world full of women stitching clothes, raising children, managing scraps of property, or navigating slavery, freedom, and labor. Can you imagine by the 17th or 18th century, a woman, maybe a widow, maybe a former slave, maybe someone who's quietly accumulated wealth over decades, walks into a legal office and sets up a foundation, a vakuf? It sounds bureaucratic, even dull. But what she's doing is powerful. She's locking her money into a permanent legal structure. No sons or brothers can claw it back after she's gone. It's hers. And it's going to work for her soul, for her name, and sometimes for people society would otherwise forget. Most often, sure, these foundations are about afterlife. Money for Quran readings, endowments for mosques, or people to pray for her soul. These are spiritual investments, but they're also social statements. I had power, I used it. And sometimes it's not just spiritual, sometimes it's infrastructure. You find women endowing bridges, roads, public water fountains. You don't do that if you're just thinking about yourself. That's a move that says, I see the world, I see where it's broken, and I can fix a piece of it. A woman funding the repair of a rural bridge isn't just helping caravans move goods, she's linking towns, communities, maybe even empires. And then there's this. Sometimes these women use their foundations to care for people directly. Let's say she used to own slaves. Maybe they served her for years, maybe even decades. When she dies, or even before, she frees them. But she doesn't stop there. She endows a house or funds a stipend through her foundation. She makes sure they don't fall into destitution. It's hard to call it justice by modern standards, of course, but it is an act of continuity, a recognition of responsibility. And the best part? We have their names, not always, but often enough to remind us that these weren't ghosts in the records. These were real women. They were playing the game of power in their own way. Women are also reading by the 17th and 18th centuries. Not all women, not even most, but enough to matter. And we're not talking about private reading only. Some of these women are trained in some cases in religious science. Girls, at least in theory, are allowed to attend Quran schools before puberty. And the real education happens at home, especially in the families of ulema, dervishes, qadis, or the spiritual elite, basically. So, this is where girls learn to read, write, and think. And then there's hadith transmission. Islamic tradition allows women to report sayings of the Prophet, and that's no small thing. That's religious authority sanctioned by centuries of precedent. You don't get to that level by chance. You study, you memorize, you teach. One of the most extraordinary glimpses we get into this world comes from Üsküp, modern day Skopje, where a female dervish writes letters to her sheikhs. This isn't fiction. These letters actually survive, and the fact that her family kept her drafts, that tells you everything. They respected her words. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, the literary salons of the 18th century aren't entirely male domains either. That's where Fitnet Hatun emerges, a poet, a woman, and utterly unafraid to rattle the egos of her male contemporaries. Fitnet Hatun is writing, and she really owns the room. In an empire where self effacing femininity is often expected, she delivers confidence with a pen. Music? It's there. Women in noble households play and compose. We know this, but their names don't survive, unfortunately, at least not until the 19th century. Their songs echo behind silk curtains, lost to history's selective memory. Still, you can hear them if you listen closely enough. And then there's the needlework, where art and utility collide. Women embroider textiles, carpets, ecclesiastical vestments, sometimes for pay, sometimes for faith, sometimes legacy. A few, like the Orthodox craftswomen, they sign their work. That's radical. It says, I was here, I made this. Most don't or can't. But we're finding more, and the fabric of history is literally threaded with their hands. I want to delve into something that became famous as the longest century of the empire, from Küçük Kaynarca to the end of the First World War. The war of 1768 to 1774, round about that time, it's a real disaster. The Ottoman fleet burns at Cheshme, Russian armies roam the Balkans, and the Treaty of Küçük Kaynarca leaves the empire bleeding. For the first time, the Ottomans lose a major Muslim territory, the Crimea, and with it a centuries-old psychological shield. The Black Sea, once an Ottoman lake, is thrown open to European ships. It's a wake-up call, and Sultan Selim III finally consolidates his rule in 1789. And he doesn't waste time. He starts pushing hard for military reform. He's trying to bring European technology and discipline into an army that still operates like it's 1683. He calls it the Nizam-ı Ceddid, the new order. But here's the tragedy. It's too little and it's way too late also. So Selim's reforms rattled the old power structures. The Janissaries, remember, they're conservative religious leaders, even some provincial governors. So there's still resistance, there's sabotage, and in the end, a palace coup brings it crashing down. Selim is deposed and killed, and his vision lives on, but it'll take blood and decades to make any of it stick. So even when the Ottomans started to build European-style armies, the victories don't really come, and they're not consistent. Because the real problems aren't just on the battlefield. They have economic and political problems that are very, very substantial. By now, the empire is outspent, outproduced, and outmaneuvered. Industrial Britain and colonial France are rewriting the global playbook, and the Ottomans are still trying to keep the ink from running on their old one. And for centuries, most Ottoman subjects, even the Christians of the Balkans, they don't rise up. The loyalty to the Sultan, or at least the fear of chaos, holds strong. But in the 19th century, something changes. A new force enters the scene: nationalism. This is a big game changer. Suddenly, it's not just elite scheming in salons, it's ordinary people in villages and cities waving flags, listening to priests and poets who tell them they're not Ottomans. They are Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Romanians, And once that emotional fuse is lit, even a reformed Ottoman army can't stomp it out easily. Meanwhile, the empire's enemies, they're not what they used to be. They are stronger. Britain is halfway through the Industrial Revolution and it's playing a global chess game, trying to protect its crown jewel, India. To do that, it needs influence in the Mediterranean, and that means meddling with the Ottomans. France, under Napoleon, tries to grab Egypt. It doesn't work, but it sends a message. The Ottomans can be invaded, even at the heart of their Islamic domain. And when Algeria falls in 1830, followed by Tunisia in 1881, it becomes clear North Africa is slipping away. But the biggest threat is, of course, Russia. The Tsars claim to protect the Orthodox Christians in the Balkans, an idea that blends religion with imperial ambition. And since the early 1700s, Russia has built an army capable of steamrolling entire regions. And they have access to warm water ports squarely in their sides. So in the early 19th century, the Ottoman state is really feeling the walls closing in. By now, the empire has not just lost territory, it's being pulled into a new kind of battle. The battle for economic survival in a world reshaped by European capitalism. So we're not just talking trade, we're talking about being absorbed into the global system where the rules are set in London, Paris, and Vienna, and it's not Istanbul. After 1815, with the Napoleonic Wars over, Europe tightens its grip on global markets. Industrialization explodes across the continent, and the Ottomans, they're way behind. Now, they're not just dealing with foreign armies, they're also dealing with foreign economies that are faster, richer, and way more connected than their own. And it's clear the empire is in dangerously deep water. And yet, inside this sublime port, the sultans are trying to move, trying to modernize, to rebuild the military, to rewire the state. There is will, there's even some vision, but there's a problem, a big one. They're up against the Janissaries. Now, you've got to understand by the 1800s, the Janissaries are not the elite, cutting edge fighting force of their medieval heyday. They're something else entirely. They're part soldier, part street power, part economic guild. They're baked into the DNA of urban society, especially in places like Istanbul, Edirne, and Thessaloniki. Many are tied up with the artisan class, blacksmiths, tanners, coffee house owners, people scraping by in the city's economic margins. And here's the thing, their military service grants them tax exemptions. In a crumbling economy, that's gold. You take that away, and you're not just asking for reform, you're really asking for revolt. So when the Sultan tries to introduce new training, new uniforms, European drills, it's not just a technical upgrade. It really poses a direct threat to the Janissaries' identity, their wallets, and their grip on the streets, right? So no wonder they resist. They resist viciously. It's really their survival instinct kicking in some way. Because modernization doesn't look like glory to them. Looks like the end of their world. The Sultan's quote unquote new order troops would make you obsolete, right? Maybe you'd have to become a criminal. You'd lose your privileges, your job, your role in society. From your perspective, it's a death sentence. So what do? You burn the barracks, right? You riot in the capital, you kill the reformers. You make it very clear that there's not going to be reforms on your watch. So here we are, early 19th century, the Sultan still trying to drag the Ottoman war machine into modern age. Muskets, drilling tactics, Western style officer training, While the reformers are thinking in terms of logistics and strategy, though, their opponents are thinking in terms of divine will. The poorer ranks of the ulama, especially those outside the elite bloodlines or inner circles of Istanbul, they're feeling the squeeze. They've trained, they've studied, but they're getting shunted off to backwater posts with meager pay and way less prestige. And they're watching a state that used to be the sword of Islam start to imitate Christian powers, France, Austria, even Russia, the same empires it once saw as enemies of the faith. So, what do? Right? There's not much left. They lean into their moral authority. If they can't wield the purse or the sword, they'll wield the word of God instead. They start preaching that legitimacy, real legitimacy, comes not from canons and consulates, but from faithful adherence to Islamic law, right? Follow the Sharia, they say, and God will grant victory. You should not imitate the infidels, they say. And this message, it resonates, especially with the artisan militias, the street level Janissaries, the ones who see modernization as a threat to their livelihoods and their identity. Together, these two groups form a kind of ideological alliance, if you will, defensive, reactionary, and deeply entrenched. Of course, not everyone buys into it. Remember Ahmed Resmi? We talked about him when we talked about the scholars, travelers, and political writers before. Figures like him, members of the Ottoman upper class, are watching this entire thing unfold with growing frustration. They are realists, technocrats, diplomats, and they don't have time for romantic fatalism. They've seen what Russian bayonets and British warships can do. They're painfully aware of how European diplomacy shifts like sand. Alliances one week, betrayals the next, To navigate this world, they argue, you need strategy, reform, and sharp-eyed diplomacy, not just piety. Out of this tension, a new idea starts to crystallize. It's something radical for its time, even revolutionary. Maybe there are universal rules to war and politics, rules that apply to Christians and Muslims alike. So they started importing European institutions and technologies, as we already said, even European ways of thinking, Prussian style officer schools, French inspired legal codes, British influenced trade policy. It's a full court modernization press, because in their view, this is the only way to survive. And survival comes at a cost, and that cost is alienation. Because down below, in the teeming neighborhoods of Istanbul, the towns of Anatolia, the hills of Albania, the markets of Cairo and Damascus, the lower classes are watching all this with growing dread. They're skeptical. And it's not just that their traditional roles are being dismantled, sort of. It's also that this whole new Ottomanism is being built above their heads, and it feels foreign and unfamiliar to them, and often un-Islamic. We're talking about a cultural revolution, which has fought over the deepest questions a society can ask. Should religion govern the state? Should the state be allowed to imitate the quote unquote infidel to survive? Who decides what it means to be Ottoman? That last one is deadly, Because every time one of these modernization schemes fails, or even stutters, the traditionalists get louder, right? See, they say, you threw away God's law for European gadgets, and what did we get by that? More defeats, more chaos, more humiliation. For them, every lost war, every economic crisis, every rebellion is proof that the modernizers are wrong. And the upper class, they start to look isolated, even illegitimate. They have European manners, speak in diplomatic French, quote Montesquieu, and yet can't stop the bleeding. And that is really what gives their critics ammunition for decades to come. Here comes Mahmud II, Selim's nephew. He's seen what happened to his uncle. You remember, right? The Janissaries killed him. He knows he can't challenge the Janissaries head on, at least not yet. So he bides his time. For over a decade, he plays the long game, reigning in the powerful provincial magnates who built their own little kingdoms in the chaos of the 18th century. He uses force, bribes, divide and conquer tactics, whatever it takes. By the time the dust settles, Mahmud has something no Ottoman Sultan has had in generations: real centralized power. And in 1826, his moment comes. The Janissaries rise again. Mahmud is ready. He crushes them utterly. The whole corps, the sacred Janissary institution, is abolished in what becomes known as the auspicious incident. Thousands are killed or exiled. Their barracks are burned. Their memory erased from the empire's DNA. What used to be a symbol of Ottoman might becomes a cautionary tale. And just like that, the lower ulema, who leaned heavily on the Janissary as their street muscle and ideological echo chamber, they find themselves sidelined. No more urban mobs, no more people's revolts against the Sultan. The cities go quiet, not because they're at peace, but because resistance has been declawed. From that point forward, Mahmud II becomes something no sultan before him had truly been in centuries: an absolute monarch, a modernizer with a monopoly on violence, a ruler with no rivals left standing. This is not the Ottomanism of Suleiman. It's something darker, leaner, and far more centralized. A neo-absolutist regime. The kind of thing you'd expect in Napoleonic Europe, not the old Islamic world. We're moving on to the end of the 18th century and what's happening in Egypt in 1798 when Napoleon lands. Remember, since 1517, Egypt is supposed to be just another province in the empire, but in practice, it's anything but. The local elite are a bizarre hybrid of old school Ottoman troops and freed military slaves, the Mamluks. These guys are relics from a medieval world that refuses to die. For centuries, they've been the real power in Cairo, organized into tight knit political households, fiercely independent and not particularly interested in what Istanbul has to say. You want to talk about regional autonomy? This is autonomy. And for a while, that kind of worked, if barely. Even the management of Egypt's Nile based irrigation system, literally the lifeblood of Egyptian agriculture, right, is more of a bottom up affair. The imperial center in Istanbul listens to wealthy village notables more than it tries to micromanage anything. But then, 1798, as we said, Napoleon lands in Egypt, and in one battle, the French obliterate the Mamluk army. Not wear them down, not outmaneuver them, they just erase them. These proud warrior leads the so-called backbone of Egyptian military power. They get vaporized by a European army that looks like it came from another planet. Napoleon doesn't hold Egypt for long. He's chased out by the Ottomans and the British, but what he leaves behind is something much more dangerous than French soldiers. He leaves behind the realization that Europe is playing a new kind of game, and the Ottomans aren't even on the field yet. This is when Mehmet Ali Pasha enters the whole stage. Initially, just another ambitious officer in the chaos of the post Napoleonic Egypt, Mehmet Ali claws his way to the top. By 1805, even Selim III, the Sultan himself, throws up his hands and recognizes him as the new governor. He's not thrilled about it, but what choice does he have? Egypt needs a strong man, and Mehmet Ali looks like one. And strong he is. In 1807, he does something no one in Cairo has dared before. He liquidates the Mamluks, not just politically, he liquidates them physically. He invites the leading households to a ceremonial gathering, then slaughters them all in a courtyard ambush, ending centuries of Mamluk influence in one blood-soaked moment. He stops the recruitment of new military slaves, ends the cycle, starts building his own army, his own administration, his own economy. And back in Istanbul, Mahmud II is watching this governor, technically his subordinate, tear down a centuries old elite, rebuild the province in his image, and survive. He's not just surviving, he's thriving, right? And that starts to shape Mahmud's own thinking. He thinks to himself, maybe this is what it takes. Maybe the empire isn't saved by compromise, but by scorched earth. And soon enough, Mahmud will try to pull a Mehmet Ali in Istanbul itself with the Janissaries. So what Mehmet Ali does in Egypt to, build a modern standing army, he's drafting Egyptian peasants. They are trained, drilled, and equipped in a way that echoes the European model. And what's even more fascinating than that is how he sustains it. He doesn't rely on foreign loans. He doesn't outsource production. He builds a state-run industrial economy, factories for weapons, uniforms, supplies, all of it fueled by monopolized trade. If you want to sell raw materials in Egypt, you go through him. He's the buyer, he's the seller, he's the bank. And it works for a while. The entire system is self-sustaining. It's a proto-industrial war machine, which is, powered by cotton, taxes, and total control. It's one of the most ambitious examples of state capitalism in the pre-colonial world. It looks, for a brief, shining moment, like Egypt might be industrializing on its own terms. But all this power makes Mehmet Ali ambitious. Between 1830 and 1840, he starts making moves, not just in Egypt, but into Syria, Palestine, and even Anatolia. Now, it's not just about regional governance, this is a direct challenge to the Ottoman Empire itself. And in the early battles of this emerging war, he wins over and over again. At one point, it looks like Egyptian troops might even march on Istanbul. Imagine that, an Ottoman vassal about to conquer the imperial capital? It's an existential crisis for Mahmud II and the House of Osman. And just like with the Greeks, it's the European powers who ultimately step in, not to protect Mehmet Ali this time, but to prop up the crumbling Ottoman center. Because a too strong Egypt, that's just as dangerous as a too weak Istanbul to them. So, what are we looking at here? A man from the provinces building a modern military industrial system, outgunning the empire that gave him the power, and eventually coming within a few cannon shots of taking the throne himself. But the great gamble ends very soon. Mehmed Ali, the provincial governor who had once stared down the entire Ottoman state, finds himself outmaneuvered, not by the Sultan, but by Europe. So in 1840, the tide turns, and it's not on the battlefield, but in the backrooms of European diplomacy, in the offices of London and St. Petersburg. Why is that, you might ask? Well, because European powers, they weren't about to let an oriental upstart like Mehmed Ali create a self sufficient, industrialized state on their southern doorstep, right? That would mean competition. It would mean a break from the neat little arrangement that funneled raw materials from the East and manufactured goods to the East. And more than that, it would challenge the entire colonial worldview. So, when Mehmed Ali stands at the peak of his power, Europe draws a line. The ultimatum is brutal here. They say, return the conquered lands, submit to the Sultan, or face war with Britain. And let's be honest, there's no real choice here. Mehmed Ali doesn't have a navy that can match Britain's. The Egyptian economy, it's innovative, but it's also fragile. It's held together by monopolies, state coercion, and a delicate balance between production and military demand. By agreeing to the Convention of London in 1840, Mehmed Ali keeps Egypt, yes, but he has to pull back from Syria, withdraw from Palestine, abandon his dreams of empire. And with that retreat comes another concession, one that gets less attention but cuts far deeper. The Ottoman customs regime is back in force. That means Egypt can no longer set its own trade policy. There's no more high tariffs to protect its industries, no more blocking European imports, no more economic autonomy. It's over. This whole state-led industrialization experiment, it may be the boldest in the entire non-Western world at the time. It comes crashing down. Mehmed Ali is remembered as a strong man, a reformer, a modernizer, a tyrant, depending on who's telling the story. But maybe most of all, he becomes a cautionary tale. What happens when a would be modern power tries to rise within a system already rigged against it? See, in the 19th century world order, the rules are being written in London and Paris, and any player who doesn't learn them fast enough gets crushed. The Ottoman Empire learns that the hard way. Egypt, even harder. So, overall, at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, we see the uprise of national movements on the Balkans, especially. The Greek War of Independence in 1821, it doesn't just erupt out of nowhere in some sort of romantic blaze of patriotism and poetry. The real engine behind all of this is the thing beneath all the blood and banners is something far more practical and familiar. It's usually money, which shouldn't surprise us. You see, by the time Europe is being torn apart by the Napoleonic Wars, Greek merchants are really making a killing. The chaos in Europe reorders the entire global trade system. French ships are blockaded, Western Europe is distracted, and suddenly Greek merchant fleets, They are nimble, orthodox, and experienced. They have open water in front of them. They seize the moment. They move grain, weapons, timber, and anything that floats and sells. They're not just getting rich, they're also making new connections. Because what this shipping boom really gives them is capital and contacts. They're sailing into Russian ports on the Black Sea, striking deals with the Tsar's people, who, by the way, loved the Greeks, shared Orthodox faith, shared disdain for Ottoman rule. Russia sees them as useful pawns, maybe even potential allies, in their long game against the Sublime Porte. So now picture this. It's not poor villagers with pitchforks talking revolution in 1821. The real scheming is happening in Odessa, a booming port city in the Russian Empire, crawling with merchants, spies, and exiles. It's there that a secret organization, the Filiki Eteria, is formed, a brotherhood of Greeks plotting to overthrow Ottoman rule and carve out their own state. So, from the Russian perspective, this whole Greek uprising isn't just some romantic Orthodox rebellion, right? It's a golden opportunity to them. I mean, we already said the Greeks are fellow Christians, and their revolt is the perfect excuse to push deeper into the Balkans, a region Russia has had its eyes on for a while. Every Greek rebel dying in the mountain is, from St. Petersburg's point of view, softening up Ottoman control, weakening the empire inch by inch. But when you look west, and Britain's playing a different game, the British don't care much for Orthodox solidarity. What they care about is trade, especially controlling the sea routes to India. So a Greek state, sure, as long as it's friendly to London, not Moscow. They want ports open to British merchants and policies that favor British interests, right? The Greek cause is worth backing, but only if it means another piece on the chessboard tips their way. Now let's talk money. Revolutions are expensive: guns, food, ships, pay for fighters. It all adds up. But here's where the Greek merchant class shines again: credit. Europe's banks see them not as rebels, but as investors with a flag, so to say. They lend, the Greeks fight, war quite literally becomes a mortgage on a new nation. So by the time we hit 1830, what happens? The big powers, Russia, Britain, France, they step in and hammer out a solution. The wars drained resources, destabilized the region they all care about, and now it's time to clean up. They forced the creation of a Greek state in the Peloponnese and Attica, small, strategic, manageable. It's technically independent, but let's not kid ourselves. It's under European protection, air quotes. That's the polite term, right? You could just easily call it control. And to top it all off, they crown a Bavarian prince, Otto, as king, a teenager, German, Catholic, foreign. Why? Because he's not Greek. Because he's not likely to rock the boat. Because he'll do what the powers tell him, right? And then, aside from the Greek uprising, we got the Serbian uprising. And it's once again the Janissaries that kick this whole thing off. Now, remember, we've already talked about this, but those once elite troops have by this point become a rogue force, sort of like mobsters roaming the city streets, right? Especially the ones holed up in Belgrade. They're running their own little warlord fiefdom, extorting, harassing, terrorizing the local Serbian population. It's so bad that even Sultan Selim III, who's no fan of disorder and is deep into trying to reform the military, actually backs the Serbs at first in trying to push these guys out. But Selim loses power and his military reform project collapses, the Janissaries aren't dealt with properly, and suddenly the Serbs look around and go, wait a minute, if the central government can't or won't help us, maybe we should just do this ourselves. And just like that, a local rebellion morphs into a full blown independence movement. Now we fast forward a few bloody, chaotic decades, and by 1830, the powers of Europe do something they've been doing a lot lately. They redraw the map. Serbia is now an autonomous principality, not fully independent, but not quite Ottoman either. It's a kind of limbo. Serbia's got self rule, but still officially exists within the Ottoman Empire for now. But let's not get carried away with romantic nationalism. Serbia at this point isn't Athens on the Danube. Unlike Greece, where you've got wealthy merchants funding revolutions from Paris or Odessa, Serbia is a peasant republic, top to bottom. No coastal cities, no merchant fleets, just muddy boots, forest pigs, and muskets. And those pigs, they're the country's lifeline, the only real export, the only source of hard cash. Now, Transylvania is the easiest to place. By this time, it's firmly in the grip of the Habsburg Empire. That's right. While the rest of Eastern Europe is wrestling with Ottoman rule, Transylvania has already been folded into Austria's imperial bureaucracy. It's ruled from Vienna, not Istanbul. But head east and things get a little more Ottoman. Moldavia and Wallachia are technically Ottoman vassal states on the map. They're still within the Sultan's empire, but they're governed by Christians, not Ottoman officials. Specifically, they're ruled by local elites under the watchful eye, but not the direct control of Istanbul. And throughout the 19th century, that local autonomy only grows. So while the rest of the empire is tightening up, centralizing under reform-minded sultans, Moldavia and Wallachia are drifting loose, politically and culturally. And this matters, because it sets the stage for a different kind of revolution. We gotta remember the social structure in these Danubian principalities is nothing like what you'd find in the core Ottoman provinces. In the Balkans or Anatolia, Ottoman rule brought a certain degree of legal protection for peasants. Serfdom, in the Western sense, was practically unknown. Not so in Moldavia and Wallachia. Here you've got the boyars, the local aristocracy, who've built a full-blown feudal system, complete with serfs tied to the land. The peasant majority population is crushed under the weight of labor dues, taxes, and outright coercion. In many ways, this looks more like Tsarist Russia or medieval Poland than anything Ottoman. When we look at what we now call Bulgaria, the pace of change there is, well, let's just say it's more of a slow burn than a revolutionary blaze. Compared to the rapid nationalist uprisings elsewhere in the Balkans, Bulgaria's path toward autonomy creeps forward with caution. Geography plays a big role here. Bulgaria sits right in the middle of the imperial tug of war. It's not just about the Ottomans anymore. The Russian Tsars loom large on the horizon, casting a long and complicated shadow over Bulgarian aspirations. When things begin to stir after 1826, it's not some sudden explosion of nationalist fervor. It's more like tectonic plates grinding. They're slowly building pressure. So the first rumblings, they are economic. The cloth factories in Plovdiv and nearby towns start ramping up their production. Why? Because the Ottoman army needs wool, and where there's demand, there's growth. Industry blossoms, not as some capitalist revolution, but because empires need uniforms. Even more fascinating is the cultural front. Before the bullets fly or borders shift, it's the battle of the books and the pulpit that sets the tone. Bulgarian merchants, some of them camped out in Istanbul for decades, start pushing back against the dominance of the Greek language. So, this is when they're not just trading goods anymore, they're printing pamphlets now, challenging the cultural hierarchy and laying the intellectual groundwork for something bigger. And then comes the Exarchate, an Orthodox church of their own, separate from the Greek led Patriarchate and the imperial capital. The Ottomans, surprisingly, don't crush it, they tolerate it. Maybe they think it'll keep the Bulgarians in line. But what they don't realize is that this religious break becomes a proto nationalist symbol, almost like a flag that hasn't been sewn yet, or a border that hasn't been drawn. For many Bulgarians, joining the Exarchate is more than just a church decision. It's an act of identity, maybe even of defiance. So picture this. You are in a part of the world where everyone wants to be a player, but no one has the tools. These are overwhelmingly rural societies: Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, villages, farms, small towns, maybe some craft workshops if you're lucky, but no factories, no real industry, which means one thing when it comes to war. You're not making your own guns, you're buying them. Usually from the very powers you're trying to outmaneuver. And yet, despite the lack of industrial base, everyone's building armies, not small militias, armies. So why is this happening? Because none of these new or semi-new states are happy with the borders they've got. Greece wants to liberate every Greek speaker from Ottoman rule. Serbia dreams of Slavic unification. Bulgaria eyes the lands where Bulgarians are set to live, whether or not they fall under the imperial umbrella. Expansion is the name of the game here. A lot of the rulers sitting on these Balkan thrones, foreign princes, dynastic imports, guys with good European pedigrees, but not a whole lot of local street credibility. So, how do you win hearts and minds when you're not exactly one of the people? You promise more land, right? You wrap yourself in the flag and point to the unredeemed territories beyond your borders. Expansion becomes legitimacy. But there's a problem with that. Actually, several problems. One of them is named Britain. You see, London doesn't want any of this getting out of hand. For most of the 19th century, right up through the 1880s, British policymakers are less worried about Balkan nationalism and they are about one big looming threat, which is Russia. As long as the Ottoman Empire exists, it's a buffer against Tsarist expansion. That's why every time the Greeks get bold and try to snatch some territory, there's usually a British diplomat wagging a finger, or a Royal Navy ship offshore. And here's the crazy part: none of these Balkan states think they've got enough. In the language of the time, they're not satiated powers. They are hungry for land, for people, for prestige. That means military budgets stay bloated. Soldiers eat up tax revenue. And when that's not enough, the borrowing begins. Loans pile up. Before long, you're not just marching toward the next war, you're marching toward default. Alright, now we are entering the post 1870 phase in the Balkans, the part where things really get messy. Up until that point, the Balkan principalities are more or less on the same page. They're all looking at the Ottoman Empire like it's a massive buffet, each picking out a favorite dish, and crucially, they're not reaching for the same ones. The Greeks want this, the Serbs want that, and the Bulgarians are eyeing something entirely else. Everyone's got room to grow without stepping on each other's toes, right? But then, around 1870, something shifts. The easy pickings are gone. The territory is still under Ottoman rule. They are ethnically mixed, historically murky, and politically volatile. Suddenly, everyone's staking a claim on the same real estate. This is when we enter the era of rival nationalist projects, each wrapped in their own flag and historical justification. Let's talk about Greece first. If there's ever a nationalist project with mythic ambitions, it's the Megali Idea, the great idea. The dream, nothing short of reviving the old Byzantine Empire, not literally but spiritually and geographically. That means Constantinople. That means the Aegean coast. That means Greek speaking communities scattered across Asia Minor and beyond. Fast forward to the aftermath of World War I, Greece, under the leadership of Eleftherios Venizelos, a shrewd, modernizing statesman with serious ambitions, sees a golden opportunity. The Ottoman Empire is reeling. The Allies are carving up the map, so while Venizelos is away at the peace talks, his political rivals take the reins and decide to go big. A campaign is launched in Western Anatolia aimed at bringing the quote unquote Greater Greece vision to life. And what follows is disaster. The Greeks push inland. At first, it looks like they might pull it off, but Turkish resistance, led by Mustafa Kemal, the future Atatürk, solidifies. The Greek advance stalls, then collapses. In 1922, it all comes crashing down on them. The Greek army is routed, Smyrna burns, and the dream dies hard. But that's not even the end. In 1923, the Greek-Turkish population exchange kicks in. Millions uprooted, communities shattered, centuries of coexistence erased in the name of national purity. It's one of the most traumatic moments in modern Greek and Turkish history. And with that, the Megali Idea becomes more than just a failed campaign, becomes a cautionary tale once again, a national fantasy undone by its own scale and the bloody realities of the 20th century. So, what about Macedonia, you might ask? Greece, Bulgaria, and Serbia, they each eye Macedonia. And the problem is, they all think it's theirs. And the way they try to prove it isn't with maps or treaties, it's with schools. That's right. If you're a Macedonian kid at this point, there's a decent chance you'll be sent to a Bulgarian, Greek, or Serbian run school. Each one teaches its own version of history. Each one tells you who your air quote real ancestors are. It's national identity as a classroom propaganda. It's weaponized education. And it's not just reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's about loyalty. It's about who you'll fight for when the moment comes. And things get darker. Not just looking at chalkboards and textbooks here. Bulgarian irregulars, guerrillas, insurgents, whatever you want to call them, they take to the hills and start waging a terror campaign to win the Macedonian population over. And not in the hearts and minds sense. We're talking about intimidation, assassinations, and full on village warfare. Their goal is to make life under the Greeks, Serbs, or Ottomans so miserable that turning to Bulgaria starts to look like the least worst option. Caught in the middle are, as often the case, the local people. Villagers who just want to survive. They just want to raise families and maybe avoid getting their homes torched in the latest act of quote unquote liberation, right? Meanwhile, the Ottoman army is still trying to keep a lid on it all. But by now it's stretched thin, poorly paid, and deeply demoralized. These men have been fighting a thankless guerrilla war for years. There's no breaks, no real pay, and there's no end in sight. So morale is in the gutter and their faith in the system is starting to collapse. And this is where the real political trauma begins. That same frustration, the rot and exhaustion, starts to boil over, not in the villages of Macedonia, but in the hearts of the officers themselves. These are the men who are going to form the backbone of the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. They've had enough of the old guard, enough of Sultan Abdülhamid's paranoid autocracy, and they want a new system, one with order, modernity, and a fighting chance to save the empire from complete disintegration. Let's take a breath and zoom out for a second, because between 1803 and 1912, the Ottoman Empire doesn't just fight wars, it becomes the geopolitical plaything of the European great powers. The outcome of most of these conflicts has less to do with Ottoman troops on the battlefield and more to do with what the big boys in London, Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg are willing to allow. And here's the important thing: the Sultan's government is by now practically a side character in its own story. Now, if you try to map out every war, revolt, and invasion, you'd end up with something that looks more like an earthquake chart than a timeline. But even the list is exhausting. You've got Mehmed Ali's Egyptian campaigns in 1832 and again from 1838 to 1840. Technically internal, but really a challenge to the empire's survival. And you've got the Greek War of Independence that drags on through the entire 1820s, and it takes the combined navies of Britain, France, and Russia to finally wrest the peace out of it. And then there's the Russo-Turkish War of 1827-28, where a hot minute it looks like the Ottomans are going to end up as a Russian protectorate. Think about that. centuries of Islamic imperial dominance reduced to satellite status under the Tsars. That's how bad things look. Then the Crimean War in the 1850s is supposed to change the tide. The Sultan sides with the British and the French and even wins for once. But the long term strategic payoff basically zero. Fast forward to 1878, and the Russians are knocking on the gates of Istanbul itself. The Treaty of San Stefano, signed in the freaking suburbs of the capital, aims to carve out a greater Bulgaria, huge Tsar aligned and a direct threat to the Ottoman heartland. And here's where the imperial chessboard, if you want, sort of flips. The Greater Bulgaria is a red flag to every other European power. Austria-Hungary doesn't like it. The British hate it. No one wants the Russians to dominate the Balkans, so boom, Berlin Congress, 1878. The borders get redrawn. Bulgaria is chopped down to size. Not because the Ottomans demanded it, but because the other players agreed it had to be that way. End of the 19th century, Greece and the Ottomans clash again, a war that could have been the final nail in the imperial coffin. But the Ottomans actually win, as we know. That's right, they win, which buys them just a little more time. The British, who used to be the main supporters of keeping the empire intact, have now checked out. London no longer objects to carving up the empire, but because the Ottomans don't lose, the vultures circling overhead have to wait. Then 1908 hits and the fuse gets shorter. Austria-Hungary already occupying Bosnia and Herzegovina since the Berlin Congress back in 1878. They decide to make it official, annexation. That's not just a diplomatic slap in the face. It's a punch to the gut for both the Ottoman government in Istanbul and the Serbians in Belgrade. Why is that? Because Bosnia isn't just a former Ottoman province, it's full of Slavs, and the Serbs see it as part of their future, quote unquote, greater Serbia. So they are furious, and now if you've got this dangerous brew of humiliation, nationalism, and great power rivalry all bubbling up. And don't forget the wild card in all of this, Russia. The Serbs have a big brother up north, and he's getting more aggressive. Tsarist Russia isn't backing Serbia in principle, they're getting ready to go to the mat over the Balkans. That support only adds fuel to the fire. So when we look ahead to World War I, the Balkan tension isn't just background noise, it's the powder keg. And Austria's move in 1908, that's one of the key sparks. Everyone's building alliances, drawing up war plans, arming up, because they all know that this isn't just about Bosnia. It's about the future of Southeastern Europe, the balance of power on the continent, and the last days of the Ottoman Empire. Tragically, as the Ottoman Empire shrinks, it's not just losing land, but also bleeding people, and especially Muslim populations. Remember, every time a new state peels off, Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, you get a fresh wave of expulsions, massacres, and desperate migrations. And the thing is, it's not always organized. Sometimes you get official emigration efforts, but more often it's raw, chaotic, flight in the face of war and slaughter. Take the Circassians, for example. The Russian Empire finally crushes their resistance in the Caucasus in 1863 and then basically clears them out. They're forced to flee en masse across the Black Sea into the already strained and struggling Ottoman state. Most arrive with nothing: no land, no money, nothing but trauma and disease. Istanbul gets swamped with these refugees living in horrifying conditions: tents, shacks, illness, hunger, waiting for the government to figure out what to do with them. Now, fast forward to 1876, and this powder keg of desperation and resentment explodes in Bulgaria. A Bulgarian uprising aimed at throwing off Ottoman rule breaks out, and in the chaos, Muslim civilians are slaughtered in some areas. The Ottoman response? Brutal and clumsy. The state sends in irregular troops, many of them Circassians already seething with rage from their own past sufferings. These units go rogue fast, unleashing terrible violence on the Bulgarian population. Again, massacres, revenge killings, that whole thing. And then the world takes notice. In England, where Prime Minister Disraeli has long backed the Ottomans as a bulwark against Russian expansion, these news hit them like a bomb. American and British journalists, some of them deeply sympathetic to the Christian Balkan cause, they report atrocity after atrocity, talking about 12,000 to 15,000 Bulgarian victims. Whether those numbers are precise or inflated almost doesn't matter, right? The public is horrified. The moral high ground is gone. Suddenly, supporting the Ottomans becomes politically toxic in Britain. Even Disraeli, the die-hard defender of the Eastern Question status quo, has to distance himself from the Sultan. It's a turning point, not just in Britain's relationship with the Ottoman Empire, but in how European powers justify their interventions going forward. What happens next is the empire is entering a period which is characterized by military and state restructuring. We're talking roughly about 1839 to 1878. By 1839, the Ottoman Empire is hurting. It has taken blow after blow militarily, economically, diplomatically. Reformers in the empire realize that if they keep going on like that, they're not just going to lose wars, but they're going to lose the empire altogether. So what they try is something radical, at least by Ottoman standards. They enter the Tanzimat, which literally means reorganization. So Tanzimat isn't just a tweak to some provincial tax code. This is a whole new deal between the Sultan and his people, a fundamental reshaping of how the state is supposed to function. On paper, it's revolutionary. The decree promises security of life, honor, and property to all subjects of the empire. It doesn't matter if you're Muslim or Christian, Turk or Arab, Greek, Armenian, or Albanian. You now have rights, at least theoretically. It's a major shift, especially when you realize that up until this point, most non-Muslim subjects were legally second-class citizens. And even high-ranking Ottoman officials were basically servants of the Sultan, not independent power holders. The Tanzimat reforms try to change that. They aim to create a modern, bureaucratic, and legally consistent empire. The old slave of the Sultan model, if you will, where even powerful viziers served entirely at the Sultan's whim, is replaced by something that looks a little more like modern civil service. But the story doesn't stop there. In 1856, after the empire survives the Crimean War, with the help of Britain and France, the pressure from those European allies ramps up. They say, look, if you want our continued support, you need to go further. equal rights really need to mean equal rights. So the empire issues another reform edict. This one going even further. Islam remains the state religion, but now the decree spells it out. All free male subjects are equal before the law. Again, that's a huge deal in a world where religion used to determine your legal rights, your taxes, and even your dress code. But there is a catch. A lot of these changes come less from internal consensus and more from external pressure. The 1856 edict, in particular, feels like it's written with one eye on London and the other on Paris. The European powers are basically saying, you want our support? Civilize your empire according to our terms. And the Ottomans, trying to survive, comply. At least they do so on paper. So while the Tanzimat sounds modern and progressive, and in many ways it is, it's also a story of imperial survival, of trying to modernize just enough to stay in the game, while also balancing old power structures and mounting foreign influence. So when we hit 1858, right in the thick of the Tanzimat reform era, and the Ottomans turned their attention to one of the most fundamental pillars of power in any state, which is, of course, land. Let's pause and think about land for a second, maybe. In an agrarian empire like the Ottoman one, land isn't just dirt, it's wealth, it's food, it's political leverage, it's status. It's also the backbone of the tax system, right? So if you're the Sultan and you can't figure out who owns what and who's supposed to pay what for it, you've got a serious governance problem, isn't it? So the Ottomans try to fix that. They passed a land code in 1858, and this thing is supposed to straighten out centuries of messy, overlapping property claims. Before this, you could have one person farming the land, another one with grazing rights, someone else collecting taxes of it, and maybe even a fourth person who inherited a partial share. It's total chaos. The Ottomans want to streamline all of that. They say only one person gets their name on the deed. Now, the state still technically owns the land. This is the Ottoman concept of miri land, meaning land that's technically part of the state's domain, but in practice, if you use the land and pay your taxes, you're the de facto owner. If you don't, well, the state can confiscate it. This was supposed to encourage active farming and better productivity. If your land just sits there, you lose it. So far, so good, at least on paper. The state's also thinking big here. If they can simplify land ownership, they can create a market for land, right? People can buy, sell, and invest. They're trying to get this Ottoman version of capitalism rolling, and better land use is part of that plan. But here's the thing, it's a classic example of a well-intentioned reform blowing up in people's faces. Because the law says only individuals can own land. Communities that had held land together for centuries suddenly find themselves out of sync with the law. So what happens? Some elder or tribal leader, someone with social clout, they go ahead and register the land in their own name. And just like that, the rest of the community legally cut out. Overnight, they go from co-owners to squatters. And this happens all over in southern Anatolia among the nomads, and particularly in places like Syria, where communal and kinship-based ownership is the norm. The reform was meant to bring clarity, but it ends up concentrating land in the hands of the socially powerful and politically connected. It sows resentment, inequality, and really lays the groundwork for conflict, kind that festers for decades. So, what was supposed to be a rational, modernizing move turns into a quiet land grab, an unintended transfer of wealth and power, and it's cloaked in bureaucratic language. And the empire, well, it walks away thinking it just cleaned up its land system when in reality it lit a fuse under the very communities it was trying to stabilize, of course. Now, we hit the mid 19th century, around 1850, and we shift our lens from the battlefield to the city streets. This is where the story of Ottoman Empire starts to take on some very modern, almost cinematic undertones, if you will. Picture Istanbul, the imperial capital, ancient, winding, and wood built, a place of dense neighborhoods, narrow alleys, and let's be honest, it's a fire hazard waiting to happen. Fires tear through entire districts with terrifying frequency at the time. Now, with the Tanzimat reforms underway, the Ottoman elite gets the itch, not just to put out fires, but to remake the city in the image of Europe. And what's the blueprint here? Paris. The empire's upper crust has been to France. They've strolled down Baron Haussmann's wide boulevards. They've gazed at the symmetry, the clean lines, the sense of power in stone. That's what becomes their idea of modernity and a city that projects strength, hygiene, and control. So, what do? They start ripping out cul-de-sacs, widening roads, and laying out new squares. Carriages are becoming trendy among the wealthy, and those beasts need to roam to move. Plus, with every new avenue and square, there's an aesthetic declaration, right? We belong to the modern world, is the message here. But this isn't Paris, of course. The Ottoman state, especially by the 1850s, is already struggling under the weight of war debt and refugees. It doesn't have the deep pockets of Napoleon III. So, how do you fund urban transformation on a shoestring? Well, you turn to private capital, which in this case means tapping into wealthy businessmen, including a growing number of foreign nationals. Some of these guys are local elites, some are Levantine magnates, some are, foreign concession hunters looking to profit off Ottoman modernization. So now, if you've got a city administration that needs to be able to negotiate, coordinate, and sometimes defend itself from the predatory instincts of big money contractors, that means, of course, setting up new municipal councils, often with local notables and sometimes non Muslim notables, to guide the process. This is more than just urban planning. We're talking about a political experiment here, because underneath all of this is a deeper agenda, of course. The Tanzimat reformers want to bind the empire together, and they know that non Muslims, especially Jews in places like Salonika and Christians in the Balkans, they have money, they have influence and grievances. So, by bringing them into these new councils, giving them a seat at the table, maybe just maybe, they'll start seeing the Sultan not as a distant overlord, but as a partner in the future. And it kind of works. Among the Jewish communities, particularly in cosmopolitan cities like Salonika, there's real enthusiasm. These reforms offer stability, visibility, and some political leverage, right? But among the Balkan Christians, not so much. By now, nationalism is in the water and it's starting to spread like a wildfire. And when given the choice between a multi ethnic empire and the dream of a homogeneous nation state, most of them eventually start leaning toward the latter. As we're moving on in time, we witness a significant shift in internal mechanisms of the empire. So Mahmud II is dead, and with him goes the last strong, centralizing sultan in the traditional sense. So the real power, it starts sliding into the hands of the Grand Vizier, and not just him, but the growing web of bureaucrats underneath him. What we are watching is a quiet revolution, a transition from personal rule to something more institutional. Think about that. For centuries, the Ottoman political system had been driven by personal relationships, by the patronage game. You got promoted because someone powerful liked you or needed you, and in return, you owed them absolute loyalty. That system doesn't vanish overnight, right? But by the mid to late 19th century, its reach is shrinking. In its place comes a new world: ministries, rank structures, job descriptions, and crucially, training programs. And guess what becomes a ticket to power in this new order? French. French isn't just a language here, it's the key to Western knowledge, diplomacy, law, and military science. If you're a young Ottoman trying to rise, mastering French opens doors into the modernizing state machinery. While this rising bureaucracy is very efficient, it's also aloof, and it answers to a sultan who, by this point, is a passive figurehead. So that vacuum of real leadership, that's going to breed opposition, and yeah, it really does. So what we see next is the emergence of the so-called young Osmans or young Ottomans, a group that's fired up, fed up, and determined to challenge the elite bureaucrats. And leading this charge is a man who isn't a general or governor, but a poet, Namik Kemal. Now, Kemal is fascinating. He's not calling for a simple return to the past. Kemal is pushing for something bold, a fusion of Islamic values with political reform, with cultural renewal, and yeah, constitutionalism. And his allies aren't just scribbling pamphlets, they are building the intellectual scaffolding for what will, years later, morph into Turkish nationalism. And just when it seems like things couldn't boil over any faster, they do. The empire gets rocked by the defeats of 1876, and suddenly the reformers have their moment. Sultan Abdulaziz is overthrown, a constitution is declared, and even a parliament is elected. A radical experiment in representative governance, and all in the heart of an empire that once ruled through edicts and imperial whim. This constitution is more than just a symbol, it locks in the idea of legal equality for all subjects, Muslims and Christians alike. But behind that legal language is realpolitik. What the Ottomans are trying to do here is trying to cut off European meddling, which often came under the pretext of protecting Christian minorities. If everyone's legally equal, the logic goes, then the Russians, the British, the French, they've got no more excuse to intervene, right? And standing tall in all of this is Midat Pasha. Not just a paper pusher, but a governor, a reformer, the kind of guy who gets things done. His fingerprints are all over this constitutional moment. Now, Abdulhamid II is one of the most enigmatic and polarizing figures to ever sit on the Ottoman throne. But before he enters the stage, let's have a quick detour through a short and strange episode with Murad V. Now, Murad, he's the great liberal hope, the guy the constitutionalists think they can work with, but the job absolutely wrecks him. He's fragile emotionally and mentally. And the pressures of empire, foreign threats, domestic chaos, they break him down in just 3 months. That's not just short by Ottoman standards, that's a nervous breakdown on the throne, really. So the guy who steps in next is Abdulhamid II. This guy rules from 1876 to 1909, and historians still can't quite agree on what to make of him. He's either the last true sultan who holds the empire together with grit and guile, or he's the paranoid autocrat who shuts down every attempt at reform and digs the grave a little deeper. Maybe both. Let's break this down. On foreign policy, he's clever, slippery even. He doesn't win wars, but he buys time, and that time is everything. The empire doesn't fall on his watch, and that's no small feat considering the sharks constantly circling in the Mediterranean, the Balkans, and the Caucasus. Domestically, though, he rolls back the constitutional experiment faster than you can blink. The palace becomes the nerve center of the state again, and Abdulhamid builds a massive surveillance machine. He builds a web of spies, informants, and double agents, all designed to report on what officials, clerics, intellectuals, heck, even school teachers are thinking and not just doing. The paranoia ramps up as he ages. He becomes a prisoner of his own fears, almost never leaving his fortified palace perched above Besiktas, convinced an assassin could be lurking around any corner. And given the revolutionary winds of the late 19th century, maybe he's not entirely wrong. Abdulhamid, he kind of rebrands the empire. He starts leaning hard into Islamic identity, calling himself not just Sultan but Caliph, a title with real emotional weight across the Muslim world. And for many Muslims outside the empire, in India, for example, he becomes a symbol of resistance against European colonialism. Even if he can't send troops, he sends hope, and sometimes that's more powerful, isn't it? Back home, the demographics are shifting. After bleeding territory in the Balkans, the empire is more Arab than ever. Abdulhamid sees this and he tries to bring Arab elites closer to the Ottoman core. Their sons are welcomed into elite schools, trained in administration and military service. It's a strategy of inclusion, and for a while this goes on and it works, but not everywhere. In Eastern Anatolia, for example, the Sultan plays a very different game. He divides and rules. The Armenians are pushing for reform and autonomy, and Abdulhamid is having none of it. So, so he builds up Kurdish irregular forces, the Hamidiyya regiments, and uses them to suppress Armenian unrest. As a result, the hatreds are deepening, and you can practically feel the ethnic fault lines starting to shift and crack under the surface. We're moving on to the Balkan Wars and World War One, so 1912 to 1918. The Young Turk movement, it's 1908, and the empire throws open the doors to reform once again. The Constitution is back, the press is uncensored, and for a brief, flickering moment, it feels like a new Ottoman dawn. People across the empire, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Turks, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, all think maybe this is it. Maybe we finally make it work. But reality once again comes crashing down fast. And what follows in 1908 isn't a golden age, it's a barrage of foreign policy nightmares, one after the other, so relentless, in fact, it's like the empire can't catch its breath. It's not just another crisis, this is a series of body blows, and the empire is already leaning on the ropes, right? So, first, there's this explosion of media, newspapers, magazines, ideas, even women's publications. Can you imagine that in the Ottoman Empire back then? Political satire. People are suddenly speaking freely for the first time in decades, but that experiment is it free expression? Well, I don't know, but it's certainly dead by 1911 because once the bullets start flying, the government slams the lid shut again. In 1911, Italy, of all countries, punches the Ottomans in the gut by invading Tripoli. What we now call Libya, that war drags on for months and sets off a chain reaction. Right in the next year, 1912, the real hammer falls. The First Balkan War, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, they all form an alliance, a Christian coalition, if you will, and they all attack the Ottomans at once. It's a feeding frenzy, and the Ottoman military is in no shape to stop it. The Balkans, that old battleground of empires, it just gets ripped apart. Even Edirne or Adrianople, the old Ottoman capital, the city that was once the symbol of Ottoman entry into Europe, it falls, and now the enemy is at the gates of Istanbul. The panic, palpable. But wait, it gets even messier. In 1913, these Balkan allies turn on each other like wolves fighting over a carcass. Serbia and Greece gang up on Bulgaria, and in the chaos, the Ottomans see their chance and retake Edirne. A tiny flash of redemption, but doesn't change the big picture. The empire's European holdings are vanishing, and then there's Albania, a region that's mostly Muslim, once loyal to the Sultan. But even the Albanians say, we're out. In 1913, they declare independence and they get it. So by the time World War I is even on the horizon, the Ottoman Empire in Europe, it's been reduced to a rump state. Basically, it's just Eastern Thrace, the land we now think of as part of modern day Turkey. So now we're in the shadow of the Great War. And the Ottoman Empire stands at a crossroads it can't afford to get wrong. It's August 1914, and the world is unraveling in slow motion. The great powers are lining up, Allied versus Central Powers, and Istanbul has to pick a side. But this isn't a choice made from strength, this is a desperate, anxious roll of the dice. After a brief power shuffle and a military coup in 1913, the Old Guard, the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, is back in charge. These guys are the Young Turks, the same folks who promised constitutional glory just 6 years earlier. and now they're hardened, pragmatic, and paranoid. The empire is afraid, afraid of Russia, first and foremost. The Tsar's eyes are locked on the straits, the gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. If Russia grabs the Bosporus and Dardanelles, it could choke off Ottoman trade, isolate the capital, and turn the empire into a sitting duck, basically. So the Ottomans go knocking. First at England's door, they're hoping maybe they can cut a deal. No dice. Then they try Russia, but there's no appetite in St. Petersburg for letting the Ottomans keep strategic turf. Rebuffed on both fronts, the Ottomans turn to Germany and the Central Powers, and that's how the empire steps into World War One. A decision made less out of ambition and more out of fear and geopolitical survival instinct. Here's the brutal truth: the Ottoman Empire is not ready for this kind of war. Not logistically, not industrially, not even agriculturally. The empire is a patchwork of provinces stitched together by history, not railroads. Infrastructure is a disaster. Need to move grain to feed an army? No trains, no trucks. The state has to rely on peasant women carrying sacks of wheat on their backs. That's not hyperbole, by the way. That's the level of dysfunction we're talking about. Even worse, to get supplies to the front lines, the government starts confiscating oxen, the same animals farmers rely on to till their fields. Agriculture takes a nosedive, food production plummets, and famine looms over entire regions. And when soldiers, already hungry, already exhausted, start seeing what's happening back home, they desert. Thousands of them. And where do they go? Not back to their villages. Many have been uprooted, some destroyed. They go into the hills, forming bands of desperate armed men, bandits really, just trying to survive. So in the end, what starts as a calculated entry into the war turns into a slow motion collapse of supply lines, of military discipline, of the basic social fabric. The Ottoman Empire joins the greatest conflict in human history and starts bleeding out almost immediately. Now, here's the other half of the story: Germany's angle. While the Ottomans are trying to avoid isolation, the German Empire, already feeling shut out by the old imperial club of Britain and France, is playing the long game in the East. By the time World War One breaks out, Berlin's been working for years to secure a place at the Ottoman table. Militarily, economically, strategically, and they don't just send their diplomats, they send generals. In 1913, just a year before the war explodes, Germany manages to plant one of its top military minds, General Liman von Sanders, as Inspector General of the Ottoman Army. Now, that might sound ceremonial, but it's not. This is a direct pipeline from the German general staff into Ottoman military planning, an open vein of influence. The British and Russians lose their minds over this. In St. Petersburg, it feels like a German knife pointed at the Russian underbelly. But Germany's not just interested in troop drills and military decorum. It wants steel, oil, and leverage. That's where the Baghdad Railway comes in. A project that's basically a geopolitical lit fuse. And on paper, it's a railway stretching from Berlin all the way to the Persian Gulf, threading through Ottoman territory, linking German industry with Mesopotamian oil. In reality, though, it's a nerve jangling provocation. The British see it as a dagger at India's throat. The French and Russians see it as a threat to their own spheres of influence. And while this train line is still unfinished in 1914, it's already doing its job, dividing empires and drawing battle lines. Once the war begins and the Ottomans are in the German camp, that relationship only deepens. Berlin becomes Istanbul's financial lifeline. The Ottomans, chronically broke and overextended, they start taking out massive loans from German banks. But of course, this isn't to be mistaken for charity, right? German industrialists and financial houses want collateral, mines, oil fields, and rights to profitable assets across Ottoman lands. Let's drop into 1914 when the Ottoman Empire finally decides to roll the dice against the Russian bear in the Caucasus. Now, this campaign is ambitious, some would say suicidal, and it's winter in eastern Anatolia. If you've ever seen a map of Sarıkamış, you know. This isn't just some frosty skirmish, this is freezing death in the mountains. And that is exactly what happens. The Ottomans push into the Caucasus grossly unprepared, thin uniforms, no proper supplies, and Mother Nature slaughters them. Tens of thousands freeze or starve. It's one of the most devastating self-inflicted wounds of the entire war. And then things get even worse. Right around this time in the eastern provinces, tensions between Armenians and Muslims boil over. There's violence on both sides. When the Armenians in Van stage an uprising and the Russians swoop in to take the city, the Ottoman leadership freaks out. They see a fifth column, a traitorous population behind their lines, and they decide to act brutally. What follows is a mass deportation, an unofficial euphemism for what is, in reality, a deadly forced march. Armenians are ordered from their homes, most of them not even from the uprising zone, and sent south toward what's now northern Iraq. But they are not protected. Quite the opposite. Irregulars attack the convoys. The army often looks the other way, or joins in. Villages are wiped out. Women and children are enslaved in some areas, especially in the province of Diyarbakir. Starvation and disease finish off many of those who survive the journey. And here's where it gets even more chilling. Some Turkish historians today openly admit that elements within the Ottoman government likely used the chaos of war as a cover to permanently cleanse Anatolia of its Armenian population. Whether or not it fits the legal definition of genocide isn't even the central debate anymore among Turkish scholars. That ship has sailed in most of the Western world anyways, but there's now a firm consensus this was genocide. The loss of life isn't limited to Armenians, however. Muslim populations, particularly refugees fleeing the Russian advance, suffer horrific losses too. The region becomes a death zone. Millions displaced, hundreds of thousands dead. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the Ottomans pull off a surprise success at Gallipoli. They dig in and repel a massive amphibious assault by British and Anzac forces. Think about the significance here. We're not just talking about a tactical win. It's a morale booster too, proof that they can still hold their own defensively. Ottoman troops also managed to hang on to key positions in Iraq, even winning a major victory at Kut al-Amara in 1916. And they hold Medina, yes, that Medina, until the very end of the war in 1918, despite British-supported Arab uprisings and the romanticized exploits of T.E. Lawrence. So while the Ottomans take blow after blow, they don't yet collapse, but their wins are mostly defensive, reactive. The Gallipoli victory, it closes the Dardanelles to the Entente. That means no easy link-up between British and Russian troops in the Eastern Mediterranean. Strategically, it buys time. Politically, it's a brief moment of Ottoman pride in an otherwise catastrophic war. All right, we're in the twilight of the First World War, and the Russian Empire, once the mighty hammer to the Ottoman anvil on the Eastern Front, implodes. The year is 1917, and the Bolsheviks have seized power. The Tsar's armies, they're gone. The fronts are collapsing. For the Ottomans, this is a once in a generation opportunity. Suddenly, the Caucasus opens up like a prize chest. There's chaos in the region, a short lived experiment in unity called Transcaucasia forms, but as you might expect in such unstable times, it splinters almost immediately into three separate republics: Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The Ottomans smell blood and oil. Now, thanks to the Germans, who are themselves arm twisting a desperate Bolshevik regime at Brest-Litovsk, the Ottomans get back to some of what they lost in 1878: Kars, Ardahan, Batum, minus the city itself. It's like watching an old empire claw back fragments of its former self, just as it's dying. And they don't stop there. Ottoman troops, maybe dreaming big, start pushing toward the oil fields of Baku, that shimmering jewel of black gold on the Caspian. There's a war with the Armenian Republic too. It's a frantic, grasping moment, one last lunge east while the window's still open. But things are changing. By 1920, we're into post-war territory, and something new is brewing in Ankara. Mustafa Kemal, not yet Atatürk, is rising from the ashes of imperial collapse. He cuts a deal with the Bolsheviks. They agree to let Turkey keep those three regained provinces, and in return, the Soviets move to cement control over the fragmented Caucasus by installing regimes friendly to Lenin's vision. Meanwhile, on the Syrian front, things are falling apart. Locusts swarm the fields, yes, literal biblical plagues. And the Ottoman state, it's already stretched thin, starts seizing food supplies. What follows is a devastating famine, especially in and around Beirut. People die in droves, and yet it barely registers in most mainstream World War I histories. And then comes the British. Allenby captures Jerusalem in December 1917. Ottoman forces begin their long, slow, agonizing retreat through the Levant. And within a year, British troops have Syria. The Ottomans, they're finished militarily. The imperial war machine collapses just as the Central Powers allies fall apart in Europe. Then comes the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, a map-carving massacre. It slashes up Anatolia, offering slices to the Greeks, Armenians, French, British. Everyone wants a piece. But this time, something changes. The Turks don't roll over. Mustafa Kemal leads a resistance that's organized, modern, and fanatically determined. Between 1919 and 1922, he beats the Greeks back. It's dirty, it's brutal, but it works. And so the Treaty of Sèvres is thrown into the fire, and the Treaty of Lausanne rises from the ashes. It's 1923, and for the first time in centuries, a sovereign Turkish republic is born, recognized by the global powers. The Ottoman Empire is dead. Long live Turkey. But that, as they say, is another story. The founding of the Republic of Turkey in 1923 is one of the boldest social experiments in modern history. The architects of this republic, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, don't just want to build a new state. They want to break the past over their knee and remake everything from scratch. No more sultans, no more fez, no more Arabic script. The capital, it's moved to Ankara, a sleepy Anatolian town that suddenly finds itself the epicenter of a new political universe. The Ottoman legacy, as far as the early republic is concerned, it's dead weight. Even the alphabet gets tossed. Latin replaces Arabic in 1928, severing millions of citizens from their written heritage overnight. But like with so many revolutionary moments, the break is never as clean as it's claimed to be. Sure, the rhetoric is about rupture, but the deeper you dig, the more continuity you find. Young Turks become Republican bureaucrats, Ottoman officials become Republican ministers. The imperial state's muscle memory lingers well into the new era. And by the Second World War, the narrative starts shifting again. Suddenly, the Ottomans aren't just the old regime, they are the glorious ancestors, the early conquests of the sultans, the courtly grandeur of the 16th century. Even the architecture once dismissed as Oriental excess, all of it starts getting rebranded as national heritage. The same empire that the Republic once defined itself against becomes a source of legitimacy. That emotional charge around Ottoman memory, it still runs hot today. Museums, novels, TV shows. People can't get enough of the empire. But there's a countercurrent too, especially among historians. Many scholars now say, wait a minute, let's stop mythologizing and start studying. And from that comes a new focus on continuity, not just in political structures, but in social elites, cultural habits, even economic policies. Some push the quote unquote break in Turkish society all the way to 1950, when the opposition wins national elections and the single party system ends. This reassessment isn't limited to Turkey. In the former Ottoman provinces, the memory of the empire is a patchwork of reactions. In the Arab world, it's complicated. Some historians see Ottoman rule as a foreign yoke that only delayed national liberation. Others argue the empire actually protected the Islamic world from European domination and that early Ottoman rule brought political stability and economic order to the Arab provinces. Over in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, though, the story is harsher. In places like Greece and Bulgaria, post independence elites go all in on redefining national culture, often by erasing Ottoman traces. Ottoman architecture is left to rot or outright destroyed. Cultural memory is deliberately scrubbed clean. In some cases, like Bulgaria in the 1980s, that sort of historical cleansing turns brutal, with forced name changes and the expulsion of Muslim citizens. And yet, even here, the tide is turning slowly. Greek and Bulgarian historians are starting to take a more nuanced, analytical approach to Ottoman history. On the Turkish side, scholars are learning Greek, digging into Ottoman records, collaborating across old national boundaries. Feminist historians are reading Armenian feminist writings in Ottoman Turkish. Trade and capitalism, no longer seen as imperialist tentacles, but as real attempts by non Muslim subjects to gain economic independence in a rigged global system. So, what's the big picture here? It's that the Ottoman past is not just a legacy to be inherited or a burden to be rejected. It's a field of contested memories and evolving narratives. And those narratives are shaped as much by modern politics as by historical facts. And the people digging into that past today aren't just rewriting history books, they're redrawing the map of identity itself in Turkey and the Balkans and across the Arab world.